Good English. What does that even mean? If I asked 10 different people, I think I'd hear 10 completely different answers. Some would probably say it's perfect grammar. Others would say it's having a huge vocabulary. Some might think it's speaking with an American accent or a British accent. And honestly, for many years, I believed all of those things too. When I was younger, I thought becoming fluent meant reaching this imaginary point where I would never hesitate, never forget a word, and never make a mistake. I imagined that fluent people simply opened their mouths and every sentence came out perfectly. But the more people I met from around the world, the more I realized something surprising. That picture isn't real. I've spoken with engineers, doctors, business owners, travelers, university professors, and people working in international companies. Many of them use English every single day. And you know what they all have in common? None of them speak perfectly. They pause. They search for words. Sometimes they choose the wrong expression. Sometimes they even laugh at their own mistakes. And then they simply continue the conversation. That completely changed the way I look at language learning. Because somewhere along the way, many of us learned a dangerous lesson. School taught us that mistakes are something to avoid. A wrong answer meant losing points. A grammar mistake meant a red mark on the paper. You were rewarded for being correct, not for communicating. Little by little, many students started believing that speaking only makes sense when you're almost certain you'll say everything correctly. So what happens? People spend years studying. They finish courses. They memorize verb tables. They complete hundreds of exercises. They recognize thousands of English words. And yet, when someone simply asks, "So, tell me about yourself," everything suddenly disappears. It's not because they don't know English. It's because their brain has connected speaking with being evaluated. Instead of thinking about the conversation, they're thinking about the possibility of making a mistake. That's an exhausting way to communicate. Imagine trying to enjoy a basketball game while someone stops every few seconds to tell you every tiny mistake you make. Eventually, you wouldn't even want to play anymore. That's exactly how many people experience English. They're constantly correcting themselves before anyone else has the chance. I shouldn't say that. Maybe that's wrong. There's probably a better word. What if they laugh? Meanwhile, the other person is simply waiting to hear your idea. Most conversations aren't grammar competitions. They're exchanges between human beings. People care about stories, opinions, experiences, emotions, humor, curiosity, connection. Those are the things that make conversations memorable, not perfect grammar. Think about your own language for a moment. Do you always speak perfectly? Of course not. You interrupt yourself. You change direction halfway through a sentence. You forget words. You use simple expressions when you're tired. You repeat yourself, and nobody thinks that's strange. Because that's what real communication sounds like. English works exactly the same way. Real conversations are wonderfully imperfect. The problem is that many English learners have spent so much time inside classrooms that they've started believing classrooms represent real life, but they don't. In a classroom, the goal is often to produce the correct answer. Outside the classroom, the goal is simply to understand each other. Those are two completely different skills, and once you realize that, something interesting begins to happen. The pressure slowly starts to disappear. You stop asking yourself, "Is this sentence perfect?" And you begin asking a much more useful question. Can the other person understand what I mean? Because if the answer is yes, then communication has already succeeded. Maybe not perfectly, but perfectly enough. And I honestly think that's where real confidence begins. Not when you know every grammar rule, but when you finally give yourself permission to communicate before you're perfect. That's the difference that school rarely teaches. And once you understand it, learning English starts feeling very different.
I've been thinking about something you said, Jordan. When people tell me, "I've studied English for 10 years, but I still can't speak," I don't immediately think they need another course. I usually think they have a confidence problem, not an English problem. Because if you've spent years learning a language, you've almost certainly learned something. You know words, you recognize expressions, you probably understand much more than you realize. So why does everything disappear the moment someone starts talking to you? I think it's because school trained us to focus on being right instead of being present. Imagine you're having dinner with friends. Someone tells a funny story, another person shares an opinion, everyone laughs, and the conversation keeps moving. Nobody is stopping every sentence to analyze grammar. Now imagine the same dinner, but every time someone speaks, a teacher raises a hand and says, actually, that verb should be in a different tense. The conversation would become exhausting. That's exactly how many English learners feel inside their own heads. Before they even finish a sentence, an invisible teacher appears and starts correcting every word. No, don't say that. That's the wrong preposition. You should know a better word. After a while, it's easier to stay silent than to keep fighting that voice. The funny thing is that native speakers don't talk that way either. They simplify sentences. They repeat themselves. They change their minds halfway through an idea. Sometimes they can't remember a word, so they describe it instead. Communication is much more flexible than we imagine, but school rarely shows us that side of English. Instead, we get the impression that every sentence has to be carefully built before we say it. Real conversations don't work like that. They're spontaneous. They're a little messy. They're full of interruptions, laughter, pauses, and unfinished thoughts. And somehow, people still understand each other. That's what surprised me the most when I started speaking with people from different countries. Everyone had an accent. Everyone made small mistakes. Everyone spoke a little differently, but nobody seemed embarrassed by it. Their goal wasn't to impress anyone. Their goal was simply to connect. I wish more English learners could experience that earlier, because I honestly believe many people are much closer to fluency than they think. The problem isn't that they're missing hundreds of grammar rules. The problem is that they're waiting for permission to speak. They're waiting for the day they finally feel ready. But here's the difficult truth. That day almost never arrives. Confidence doesn't usually come before speaking. It grows because you keep speaking. Every conversation teaches you something. Every small mistake becomes less scary. Every successful interaction gives your brain new evidence that you can actually communicate. Little by little, English stops feeling like an exam and starts feeling like a real language. And that's such an important shift, because once English becomes a tool instead of a test, everything changes. You stop chasing perfection. You start chasing connection. And in my experience, that's the moment when people finally begin enjoying the language instead of fearing it. That's why I think so many of us learned English the wrong way. Not because our teachers were bad, not because grammar is useless, but because somewhere along the journey, we forgot the real purpose of language. Language exists to bring people together. And the moment you remember that, speaking English becomes a lot less intimidating and a lot more human.
You know, Laura, something else that school accidentally teaches us is that language is mainly about avoiding mistakes. Think back to almost any English test you've ever taken. The questions usually had one correct answer, one verb tense, one preposition, one perfect sentence. Your job was to find it. That makes sense in a classroom because teachers need a way to evaluate progress. But real life doesn't work that way. If you ask 5 native speakers how they would say the same idea, you'll probably hear 5 slightly different answers. Not because one is right and the others are wrong, because language is flexible. Let's say someone asks you what you did last weekend. One person might say, I stayed home and watched a movie. Another might say, I just relaxed at home. Someone else could say, I didn't do much. I was pretty lazy. They're all communicating essentially the same thing. Real conversations give you choices. School often makes you believe there's only one, and I think that's where many learners begin losing confidence. They become so focused on finding the perfect sentence that they forget to simply express an idea. I've noticed something interesting whenever I travel or meet people whose first language isn't English. The people who communicate the best aren't always the ones with the biggest vocabulary. Very often, they're the people who are comfortable using the vocabulary they already have. They don't stop every 20 seconds searching for the perfect word. They use a simpler one. If they don't know a word, they explain it differently. If someone doesn't understand, they try again. That's communication. And honestly, that's exactly what native speakers do every single day. How many times have you heard someone say, "What's that word I'm looking for?" Or, "You know, that thing." It happens constantly. Nobody thinks twice about it. But when an English learner does exactly the same thing, they suddenly feel embarrassed. Why? Because somewhere along the way, they started believing that fluent people never struggle. That's simply not true. Fluent speakers aren't people who never get stuck. They're people who don't panic when they do. There's a huge difference. Instead of seeing a small mistake as proof that they're failing, They see it as a completely normal part of talking. That mindset changes everything. Because once you stop expecting perfection, your brain suddenly has more energy to focus on the conversation itself. You begin listening more carefully. You become more curious. You respond more naturally. Instead of mentally checking every grammar rule, you're actually paying attention to the person in front of you. And isn't that the whole point of learning a language? Not to impress people, not to pass another exam, but to understand someone and to be understood in return. When you start measuring success that way, speaking English becomes much less stressful. You realize that every conversation doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be real. And I honestly believe that's one of the biggest lessons school forgot to teach us.
I think that's one of the biggest differences between learning English in school and actually using English in real life. In school, you're usually preparing for a test. In real life, you're preparing for a conversation. Those are two completely different experiences. When you're taking an exam, you're expected to remember rules, choose the correct answer, and avoid mistakes. But when you're talking to another person, nobody hands you a multiple choice test before you open your mouth. Life doesn't work like that. Imagine you're traveling in another country and you're trying to find your hotel. You walk up to someone and say, "Excuse me, I'm looking for this address." Do you think that person is secretly grading your grammar? Probably not. They're thinking, how can I help this person? That's such an important difference, and I wish more English learners understood it. Because many people carry the classroom into every conversation they have. They don't see another human being. They see an invisible teacher. Every sentence feels like an exam. Every pause feels like failure. Every small mistake feels embarrassing. No wonder speaking becomes stressful. I remember talking to a woman who had studied English for nearly 15 years. She understood movies. She could read books. She wrote emails at work. But when she had to introduce herself in English, she became incredibly nervous. After a few minutes, she stopped and apologized. She said, "I'm sorry, my English is terrible." Honestly, I was surprised because from my perspective, her English wasn't terrible at all. She had communicated every idea she wanted to express. Yes, she made a few grammar mistakes. Yes, she searched for a couple of words, but the conversation never stopped. I understood everything. The problem wasn't her English. The problem was the picture she had created in her own mind of what good English was supposed to sound like. She believed that if she wasn't speaking like a native speaker, she was somehow failing. How many people carry that same belief? Probably millions. And it's such a heavy burden to carry because you're comparing yourself to people who have spoken English every single day since they were children. That's not a fair comparison. A much better question is this: can I communicate a little better today than I did a few months ago? If the answer is yes, then you're making progress, real progress, the kind that actually matters. I also think we forget that conversations are shared experiences. The other person wants the conversation to succeed too. They're not sitting there hoping you'll make a mistake. They're helping you understand. They're adjusting their speed. They're choosing different words if necessary. They're smiling when they realize you're making an effort. Most people appreciate that effort far more than perfect grammar. I've experienced that myself many times while traveling. People were patient. They repeated themselves. Sometimes they even taught me a new expression without making me feel embarrassed. That's how communication grows. Not through fear, through kindness, through curiosity, through practice. And every conversation gives you something valuable. Maybe you learn a new expression. Maybe you discover a pronunciation you've never heard before. Maybe you realize that people understood you much more easily than you expected. Those little victories begin changing the story you tell yourself. Instead of saying, "I always freeze when I speak English," you begin saying, "Actually, I handled that conversation pretty well." That new story is incredibly powerful because confidence isn't built during the moments when everything is perfect. Confidence is built during imperfect conversations that still turn out well. That's why I always encourage people to celebrate those moments. Not because they spoke flawless English, but because they had the courage to communicate anyway. And every single conversation like that brings you one step closer to becoming the kind of English speaker you've always wanted to be.
You know, Laura, I think there's one more reason school English often doesn't work in real life. School usually teaches English as if communication happens in perfect conditions. A quiet room, a clear question, enough time to think, a teacher waiting for one specific answer. But real life is almost never like that. Real life is noisy. Someone speaks faster than you expected. Someone uses an expression you've never heard before. Someone interrupts themselves. Someone changes the topic. Someone laughs in the middle of a sentence. Someone asks you a question when you're tired, nervous, or not ready. And suddenly, the English you practiced in a textbook feels very different from the English happening in front of you. That's why so many learners say, I understand English when I study, but I don't understand people when they speak. And honestly, that makes sense because textbook English is controlled. Real English is alive. In a textbook, every sentence is clean. The speaker never changes direction. The pronunciation is usually clear. The vocabulary is selected carefully. The conversation has a beginning, a middle, and an end. But real people don't speak like textbook characters. Real people say things like, you know what I mean? They say, actually, wait, let me explain that differently. They say, I was going to say something, but I forgot. They use incomplete sentences. They use gestures. They use facial expressions. They repeat words. They pause. They laugh. They speak emotionally. And if your only experience with English is controlled English, real English can feel like chaos. But here's the important part. That doesn't mean your English is bad. It means your training was incomplete. It's like learning to swim by reading a book about water. The book can explain the movements. It can teach you the theory. It can show you pictures of good technique. But at some point, you have to enter the water. And the first time you do, everything feels different. The water moves. Your body reacts. You get nervous. You forget what you read. You need practice in the real environment. Language is very similar. You can study English for years, and that knowledge can be useful. But speaking is a physical and emotional experience, not just an intellectual one. You have to hear different accents. You have to deal with speed. You have to answer before you feel completely ready. You have to survive small moments of confusion. You have to learn how to continue even when you don't understand every word. That skill is almost never taught in school. School often teaches us to stop when we don't understand. Real conversation requires us to continue. That's a completely different muscle. And I think this is where many learners become discouraged. They think, I studied for years, so why is this still hard? But maybe the answer is simple. They studied English. They just didn't practice enough real communication. Those are not the same thing. A person can know many grammar rules and still feel uncomfortable speaking. Another person can know fewer rules but communicate more naturally because they've practiced being in conversations. That's why I love the idea of training for real life, not just for correctness. For example, instead of asking, did I say that perfectly? You can ask, did I keep the conversation going? That's a much better question because in real life, keeping the conversation going is a huge skill. If you don't know a word, can you explain it another way? If you don't understand a sentence, can you ask the person to repeat it? If someone speaks too fast, can you say, sorry, could you say that more slowly? If you make a mistake, can you smile and continue? These are practical communication skills, and they matter more than most people realize. Let me give you a simple example. Imagine someone asks you, what kind of movies do you like? A learner who is obsessed with perfect English might freeze. They might think, should I say I like comedy movies or I enjoy comedies? Is movies plural? Is it more natural to say films? What tense should I use? Meanwhile, the conversation is waiting, but a confident communicator might simply say, I like funny movies. I like movies that make me laugh. Is that sentence advanced? No. Is it clear? Yes. Does it keep the conversation alive? Absolutely. And after that, the other person might say, oh, me too. What's your favorite one? Now you have a conversation. That's the point. You don't need a perfect first sentence. You need a sentence that opens the door. Once the door is open, the conversation can help you. The other person gives you context. They ask questions. They react. They help shape the next thing you say. That is how real communication works. It's not one person performing perfectly. It's two people building meaning together. And I think this is the biggest shift many learners need. Stop treating English like a performance. Start treating it like participation. You don't need to impress everyone. You need to participate. You need to enter the conversation with what you have today, not with the English you wish you had 5 years from now. With today's English, today's vocabulary, today's pronunciation, today's confidence. because that is the only way tomorrow's English becomes stronger. And this is where school sometimes creates the wrong emotional habit. It makes people wait. Wait until you know more grammar. Wait until you have more vocabulary. Wait until your pronunciation is better. Wait until you feel ready. But real fluency doesn't come from waiting. It comes from using imperfect English, using simple English, using English when your heart is beating a little faster, using English when you have to search for a word, using English when the conversation doesn't go exactly as planned. Every time you do that, your brain learns something important. It learns, I can survive this. And after a while, it learns something even better. I can enjoy this. That is when English begins to change. It stops being a subject from school. It stops being a collection of rules. It stops being something you fear. It becomes a bridge to people, a bridge to opportunities, a bridge to stories you would never hear otherwise. And maybe that's the English we should have been practicing all along. Not perfect English, not textbook English, real English, human English, the kind of English that allows you to connect with someone even if the sentence isn't perfect. Because at the end of the day, language isn't about proving that you studied. It's about proving that you're willing to connect. And that, more than any grammar rule, is what makes someone a real English speaker.
I've been thinking about everything we've talked about today, Jordan, and I keep coming back to one simple idea. Maybe school didn't completely fail us. Maybe it simply prepared us for a different goal. School prepares us to remember information. Real life asks us to communicate with people. Those are related, but they're not the same. When I think about the conversations that have stayed with me over the years, I don't remember whether someone used the present perfect correctly. I don't remember whether every sentence was grammatically perfect. I remember how they made me feel. I remember the stories they shared. I remember laughing together. I remember feeling understood. That's what communication leaves behind. Not grammar, connection. And that's exactly why I believe so many English learners underestimate themselves. They're measuring success with the wrong ruler. Instead of asking, did I connect with someone today? They ask, did I make any mistakes? Imagine finishing every conversation by counting your mistakes instead of celebrating the fact that you actually spoke. Eventually, your brain begins believing that mistakes are the only thing that matters. But imagine changing that habit. Imagine asking yourself different questions. Did I understand more than last month? Did I keep the conversation going? Did I explain an idea even when I couldn't remember the perfect word? Did I ask someone a question? Did I make another person smile? Those are signs that you're becoming a better communicator. And isn't that why we learn languages in the first place? Not to impress people, not to win grammar competitions, but to create moments with other human beings. I also think we forget something very important. Nobody starts as a confident speaker. Not in English, not in any language. Confidence is always built one conversation at a time, one successful interaction, one uncomfortable moment that wasn't nearly as bad as we imagined, one stranger who understood us, one smile, one laugh, one story. Little by little, those experiences replace fear with familiarity. That's how confidence grows. Not overnight, not after finishing another textbook, but after hundreds of small moments that prove to your brain, I can do this. And I honestly believe that's the message more learners need to hear. You don't need permission to start speaking. You don't need perfect pronunciation. You don't need to know every phrasal verb. You don't need an advanced vocabulary before opening your mouth. You simply need the willingness to participate. Because every conversation teaches you something that no classroom ever can. It teaches you how real people think, how they react, how they express emotions, how they interrupt each other, how they tell stories, how they encourage one another. That's the English that changes lives. Not because it's perfect, but because it's alive. So if you're listening to us today and you've been waiting for the day when you finally feel ready, maybe this is the moment to change that way of thinking. Maybe you're already more prepared than you believe. Maybe the next conversation won't be perfect. In fact, it probably won't, but it might be real. And that is so much more valuable because every real conversation makes the next one a little easier. Every attempt builds confidence. Every mistake becomes experience. Every success reminds you that communication is possible. And before you realize it, something wonderful happens. You stop thinking about English every second. You start thinking about the person in front of you. The language slowly moves into the background. The connection moves into the foreground. That's when English stops feeling like homework. It starts feeling like part of your life. So don't wait until you believe you're the perfect English speaker. Start with the English you have today. Use it, trust it, keep improving it. Because fluency isn't built by waiting, it's built by showing up. Conversation after conversation. And one day you'll look back and realize something surprising. The English that once felt impossible has quietly become your own.